September 2020. A conference room in Stuttgart, Germany. Daimler executives signed documents agreeing to pay $1.5 billion to settle claims that their Mercedes-Benz diesel vehicles contained illegal software. Across the Atlantic, another settlement, $875 million to American states, $2.2 billion total. The charge, installing defeat devices in over 250,000 vehicles sold in the United States alone. Globally, the number exceeded 600,000. Every one of those cars passed its emissions test. Every one of those cars then drove onto public roads and pumped out nitrogen oxide at levels up to 5 times the legal limit. Mercedes did not make a mistake. Mercedes wrote code specifically designed to cheat. The diesel engine was supposed to save the planet. That was the pitch. European automakers spent decades convincing regulators, consumers, and governments that diesel was the clean alternative, better fuel economy than gasoline, lower carbon dioxide emissions. The technology of the future. Mercedes-Benz positioned itself at the forefront of this revolution. Their BlueTEC diesel engines promised luxury performance with environmental responsibility. The three-pointed star became synonymous with clean diesel innovation. Customers pay premium prices for vehicles they believe were helping reduce their carbon footprint. They were driving poison factories. The chemistry of diesel combustion creates a problem that gasoline engines largely avoid. When diesel fuel burns under the high pressure and temperature conditions inside a diesel engine, it produces significant quantities of nitrogen oxides, collectively known as NOx. These compounds are invisible. They are also devastating. NOx reacts with other atmospheric chemicals to create smog and ground-level ozone. It penetrates deep into human lungs. It causes respiratory disease, cardiovascular problems, and premature death. The World Health Organization estimates that outdoor air pollution kills over 4 million people annually. Nitrogen oxides from diesel vehicles are a leading contributor. To sell diesel vehicles in the United States and Europe, automakers needed to meet increasingly stringent emissions standards. The technology to achieve these standards existed. Selective catalytic reduction systems could inject urea solution into the exhaust stream, breaking down NOx into harmless nitrogen and water. Lean NOx traps could capture and store the pollutants for later processing. These systems worked. They also cost money. They required maintenance. They consumed additional fluids that owners needed to refill. They reduced engine performance and fuel economy. Every mile of clean operation came with a price. Mercedes-Benz chose a different path. They installed the emissions control equipment. They made it work during laboratory tests. Then they wrote software that recognized when the vehicle was being tested and when it was being driven on actual roads. During tests, the emissions controls operated at full capacity. The vehicle passed. The certification was granted. The car could be legally sold. Then the software detected the transition to real-world driving conditions. The emissions controls throttled back or shut down entirely. The engine performed better. The fuel economy improved. The nitrogen oxide poured into the atmosphere. The drivers never knew. The regulators never knew. The people breathing the air never knew. The defeat device software was sophisticated. It monitored multiple parameters to determine whether the vehicle was undergoing an official emissions test. Testing protocols followed predictable patterns. The vehicle would be placed on a dynamometer, a kind of treadmill for cars, and run through a specific sequence of accelerations and decelerations. The test lasted a defined duration. The ambient conditions fell within certain ranges. The steering wheel remained stationary because the car was not actually turning. The software tracked all of these signals. When the pattern matched testing conditions, emissions controls activated fully. When the pattern indicated normal driving, the controls relaxed. The engineering was deliberate. Internal documents would later reveal that Mercedes engineers understood exactly what they were building. They knew the regulations. They knew their vehicles could not meet those regulations under normal driving conditions without sacrificing the performance characteristics that customers expected. They knew defeat devices were illegal. They built them anyway. They calibrated them carefully. They tested them to ensure that cheating would not be detected. This was not a rogue engineer in a basement. This was systematic corporate fraud executed at scale across multiple vehicle platforms over nearly a decade. The first cracks appeared not at Mercedes but at Volkswagen. In September 2015, the United States Environmental Protection Agency issued a notice of violation to Volkswagen, accusing the German automaker of installing defeat devices in nearly 500,000 diesel vehicles sold in America. The scandal erupted globally. Volkswagen eventually admitted to cheating on 11 million vehicles worldwide. The company paid over $30 billion in fines, settlements, and vehicle buybacks. Executives went to prison. The term Dieselgate entered the vocabulary. Regulators who had been caught sleeping at Volkswagen now turned their attention to every diesel vehicle on the road. They began testing cars not just in laboratories but on actual streets, using portable emissions measurement systems that could record pollution output during real driving conditions. The discrepancies were immediate and damning. Vehicle after vehicle showed emissions that spiked dramatically once the car left the controlled environment of the testing facility. The laboratory results that had earned regulatory approval bore no relationship to what the vehicles actually emitted. Mercedes-Benz fell under scrutiny almost immediately after the Volkswagen revelations. German prosecutors opened an investigation in 2016. The United States Department of Justice began its own inquiry. State attorneys general launched coordinated investigations. Consumer advocacy groups filed lawsuits. The company initially denied any wrongdoing. They insisted their vehicles complied with all applicable regulations. They characterized the investigations as misunderstandings about complex engine management software. They were lying. The technical evidence was overwhelming. When researchers tested Mercedes diesel vehicles on the road, the results showed nitrogen oxide emissions far exceeding laboratory levels. A 2017 study by the German automotive club ADAC found that several Mercedes diesel models produced nitrogen oxide at more than 5 times the legal limit under real-world conditions. The vehicles performed beautifully in official tests. The vehicles poisoned the air when driven normally. The gap could not be explained by any legitimate engineering reason. It could only be explained by cheating. Investigators focused on specific software functions buried deep in the engine control units. One function, called Slipguard, reduced emissions controls when the system detected the car was not on a dynamometer. Another adjusted exhaust treatment based on ambient temperature in ways that appeared designed to maximize performance during tests while minimizing pollution control during normal operation. Internal Mercedes communications showed engineers discussing how to calibrate these functions to pass tests while preserving the driving characteristics customers expected. The discussions were clinical, entirely aware that the purpose was deception. The scope of the fraud expanded as investigations continued. Mercedes had sold diesel vehicles in the United States under the BlueTEC brand, marketing them explicitly as environmentally responsible choices. The affected models included the ML350, the GL350, the E350, the S350, and the Sprinter van, among others. Model years stretched from 2009 through 2016. Every one of these vehicles had been certified as meeting emissions standards. Every one of these vehicles had been certified as meeting emission standards. Every one of these vehicles exceeded those standards in actual use. The human cost of the deception accumulated invisibly but relentlessly. Nitrogen oxide pollution does not kill immediately. It damages respiratory systems over time. It exacerbates asthma in children. It contributes to heart disease in adults. It shortens lives by months or years in ways that can never be directly traced to a specific vehicle or a specific decision made in a Stuttgart engineering office. Epidemiologists estimate that the excess emissions from diesel-cheating vehicles across all manufacturers contributed to thousands of premature deaths annually. The victims never knew what killed them. Their families never knew who to blame. Mercedes executives maintained public denial even as the evidence mounted. They characterized defeat device allegations as misinterpretations of legitimate engine management software. They noted that European regulations permitted some adjustment of emissions controls under certain operating conditions. They argued that their vehicles met the legal requirements as they understood them. These arguments collapsed under scrutiny. The software was not making minor adjustments for engine protection. It was fundamentally transforming emissions performance based on whether regulators were watching. The German government ordered recalls. Mercedes was required to update the software in hundreds of thousands of vehicles to remove the defeat device functionality. The company complied, but the updates came with trade-offs that revealed what the cheating had been hiding all along. Vehicles that received the software updates experienced reduced performance, worse fuel economy, and in some cases reliability problems. The original calibration had been optimized for a vehicle that would cheat. A legal calibration meant compromises that customers would notice. Prosecutors in Stuttgart spent years building criminal cases. They conducted raids on Daimler facilities, seizing documents and computer files. They interviewed current and former employees. They traced decision-making chains to identify who had authorized the defeat device strategy. The investigation revealed that the cheating was not contained within a small group of rogue engineers. It had been discussed at management levels. It had been implemented across multiple vehicle programs. It had continued for years even as the company publicly denied any wrongdoing. The financial reckoning arrived in stages. In August 2020, Daimler agreed to pay $875 million to settle civil claims brought by state attorneys general across the United States. The settlement covered consumer protection violations, environmental law violations, and civil penalties. It did not require the company to admit wrongdoing, but the payment spoke louder than any admission. You do not write an $875 million check if you did nothing wrong. Weeks later, a separate settlement resolved claims with federal authorities. Daimler agreed to pay over $1.5 billion to settle investigations by the Department of Justice, the Environmental Protection Agency, the California Air Resources Board, and U.S. Customs and Border Protection. The settlements required ongoing compliance monitoring. They required corporate governance reforms. They required Mercedes to prove that future vehicles would meet emission standards during actual driving, not just during laboratory tests. German authorities imposed their own penalties. Daimler paid €870 million to settle proceedings with Stuttgart prosecutors in 2019. The payment resolved allegations that the company had negligently failed to prevent the defeat device fraud. Individual criminal prosecutions continued to work their way through the German legal system, though they moved slowly and often concluded without the dramatic sentences that American observers expected. The total financial cost to Daimler exceeded $3 billion when all penalties, settlements, and remediation expenses were calculated. This figure did not include the cost of vehicle recalls, software updates, reduced resale values for affected vehicles, or the reputational damage to a brand that had spent a century positioning itself as the pinnacle of automotive engineering excellence. The three-pointed star had become associated with fraud. The clean diesel promise had been exposed as a lie. Yet the penalties, large as they were, represented a fraction of the profits Mercedes had earned selling the affected vehicles. The diesel cars had generated billions in revenue over the years they were sold. The cheating had allowed Mercedes to offer performance and fuel economy that would have been impossible with fully functioning emissions controls. Customers chose Mercedes over competitors because the Mercedes vehicles delivered better driving experiences. That advantage was purchased through fraud. The fines were a cost of doing business, painful but survivable. No senior Mercedes executive went to prison. The criminal investigations in Germany targeted individuals, but proving personal criminal liability for decisions made within large corporate bureaucracies proved difficult. Prosecutors could show that the company had cheated. They struggled to prove that specific executives had personally authorized the cheating with criminal intent. The corporate structure diffused responsibility across committees and departments until no single person could be isolated as the guilty party. The pattern repeated across the automotive industry. Fiat Chrysler paid $800 million in settlements for its own diesel defeat devices. Volkswagen's penalties dwarfed everyone else's. But even there, only a handful of individuals faced criminal charges, and several successfully avoided extradition to the United States. The executives who made the decisions to cheat retired with their pensions intact. The engineers who wrote the code moved to other jobs. The shareholders absorbed losses that were painful but not fatal. The companies survived. The aftermath reshaped the diesel market in ways the cheating automakers had never intended. Consumer trust in diesel technology collapsed. Sales of diesel vehicles plummeted across Europe and America. Cities began banning diesel cars from urban centers. Automakers who had bet heavily on diesel as a bridge technology to an electric future found themselves stranded. The very fraud that had been designed to preserve diesel's viability accelerated its decline. Mercedes pivoted to electric vehicles with sudden urgency. The company announced billions in investment in battery technology and electric platforms. The executives who had presided over the diesel fraud rebranded themselves as electric visionaries. The three-pointed star appeared on vehicles that produced zero direct emissions, a dramatic transformation from the nitrogen oxide factories the company had been selling just years earlier. Whether this represented genuine environmental commitment or simply the next chapter of automotive marketing remained unclear. The regulatory system that had failed to detect the fraud underwent its own transformation. Testing protocols were redesigned to include real-world driving emissions measurements. Portable testing equipment became standard. Regulators gained authority to conduct unannounced audits. The gap between laboratory performance and road performance narrowed, though it never closed entirely. Automakers continued to optimize their vehicles for test conditions, just with less blatant cheating. The whistleblowers who had helped expose the fraud received little recognition and less reward. Engineers who raised concerns internally were ignored or silenced. Researchers who published damning studies faced industry pushback. The journalists who connected the dots across multiple investigations operated without the resources of the corporate legal departments arrayed against them. The truth emerged not because the system worked, but because a few determined individuals refused to stop pushing. 600,000 vehicles, 600,000 machines programmed to deceive, 600,000 sources of illegal pollution driving through neighborhoods, past schools, near hospitals. The software executed its deception flawlessly, exactly as its designers intended. The people who breathed the exhaust never consented to the experiment they were part of. They trusted that the cars on their streets met legal standards. They trusted that regulators were protecting them. They trusted that corporations would not deliberately poison the air for profit. The trust was misplaced. The regulations were circumvented. The corporations calculated that the profits from cheating exceeded the costs of getting caught. They were right. $3 billion in penalties sounds catastrophic until you measure it against the decades of premium pricing and competitive advantage the fraud enabled. The settlement checks were written from accumulated profits. The executives kept their jobs. The company kept its brand. The calculation worked. Today, Mercedes sells electric vehicles marketed with the same environmental promises once attached to BlueTEC diesel. The advertising emphasizes zero emissions, sustainability, and corporate responsibility. The engineering may be legitimate. The testing may be honest. But the gap between promise and performance has been established as a corporate pattern. The defeat devices were not an aberration. They were a solution to a business problem implemented without apparent moral hesitation by professionals who understood exactly what they were doing. 600,000 tests passed, 600,000 lies told, 600,000 vials released to pollute. The code worked perfectly. The cheating was undetected for years. The penalties, when they finally arrived, were absorbable. The lesson is not that crime does not pay. The lesson is that for crimes committed at corporate scale with sufficient technical sophistication, the punishment is a tax, not a deterrent. The software has been updated. The strategy remains available. The next defeat device is already being considered somewhere, in some conference room, by some engineer weighing the probability of detection against the cost of compliance. The math still works. The air still carries the consequences.